Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Uncorked with Funny Wine Girl. This is Funny Wine Girl, aka Janine Luby. And you know my story every week at the beginning of the episode. I will tell you how I know my guest. And why do I do this? You're probably sick of hearing it, but I'm going to keep saying it because I think it's so important that we are curious, that we are good humans, right? So that we get out there into the community and try new things or meet up with old friends, save people's contact information, reach out to people, see how we can help them, help one another, and learn from one another, right? I mean, everybody has something that they can impart to us, right? So, my guest this week is someone that, of course, I know very well, and you listeners probably know very well also. Emily Hickox of Budget Through Life. And you know me, you hear it every week. Budget Through Life is my sponsor of this podcast. But Emily has also been a guest. She's been a listener first, then a guest. We've become friends, and she always has excellent information for me. I learn from it all the time, but I know that you do as well, because Lord knows we all need a little help and a couple of reminders from time to time about how to budget through life. So, welcome, Emily, and thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me tonight. I'm excited to be here as always.
Of course. And you know what? I'll try not to derail you because, usually I'm like, what bothers me about money? And then you're like, that's great. But here's what I really wanted to talk about today. So we've spoken a few different times about budgeting. And, I mean, Emily's spoken about like getting ready for the holidays. And of course, here we are, the end of September. Depending on who you are, I'm a procrastinator. So I'm not even thinking about holiday shopping at this point. I'm just putting out my Halloween decorations. But, we've spoken about that, and that is important no matter what you do in life. It's important to have a budget and to, as we've talked about, be realistic, but also allow for some joy in your life so that you're not overly stressed. But this time, this week, this episode, what we're going to talk about is different scenarios, budgets that you use in different scenarios. And I think that we probably all of us can relate to these types of budgets. So, where you want to begin? There are three that you're going to cover, right, Emily? So let's get started with the first one.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so there's a lot of different kinds of budgets, and when I teach classes and I talk to different groups of people, I'll start out by asking them how they feel about the word budget, and I do that in a variety of ways. I change it up all the time depending on the audience, but most people give me answers that are pretty negative. When you ask how they feel about a budget, they're like, "Oh, restrictive, demeaning, demoralizing, a punishment." It's usually very negative words, and restrictive is always in there. It's always one of the words that comes up.
Kind of like a
And
diet, right?
exactly like a diet. And I actually have a slide in almost all my presentations that says budgeting is a lifestyle, not a diet. So I could do a whole talk just on that. But it is a lifestyle because, just like with diet, like you've got to change, you've got to ebb and flow. I mean, I'm learning the hard way with diet that, once you get close to a certain age, you got to change it up or your body rejects everything. But coming back to budgeting, when I talk to people that don't regularly budget or it hasn't been part of their life, they're often thinking of what I call crisis budgeting. Their experience with having to live on a budget comes from something negative, some sort of trauma, whether it's big or small. Maybe they've lost a job, maybe they bought too much house. That's a real common one. And all of a sudden they realize, I don't have enough money to make ends meet. I need to really restrict my spending, and I need to be very careful with every single dollar. So that is what most people think of when they think of budgeting, and they don't think of the other times in life where a budget can be really useful. So I'll start with talking about crisis budgeting a bit, but then I really would love to talk more about the areas where budgeting gets a little more fun and a little
Mm,
less stressful.
not so punitive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because we're going to have moments in our life where we need to tighten up. We need to be really careful. And it can happen to anybody, and it can happen even on purpose. I can speak for myself. I know you and many of our friends know my story of having a major career change and a very significant change to the income of my household. And the only reason I was able to get through that time the way I did was because I knew how to crisis budget. So when you're crisis budgeting, you are looking at every single expense. You are not messing around. You are watching your bank account, and if you're me, you're in your spreadsheet every day. If you're an app person, you're in your app, or you're on your pencil and paper, whatever medium you choose. You're looking at it almost every day. And it's for two reasons. One, it's because you can't mess around. You need to know where all those dollars are. You need to make sure that they're doing exactly what you want them to do when things are really tight. But also, and especially for women, it brings us that sense of control when other areas of our life feel out of control. So when you're going through a major life change, going through a career change, a divorce, a new child, a medical emergency, whatever it might be, having something to turn to that can give you that feeling of control really does have an impact on our mental health when we're going through those hard times. So when you're looking at a crisis budget, you're looking at being as lean as possible. You are cutting out everything you don't absolutely need. And Janine, you and I have talked. I hate the words needs versus wants.
That's
But with
right.
crisis budgeting, we are this is not the time to mess around. We are saying, okay, yes, this is something I'm going to want in the future, but for today, it's got to go. And I'll use a really tough example. And I've run into this personally with my clients, with friends, gym memberships.
Mm.
And the reason this is hard is because gym memberships or yoga classes, whatever you might be spending your money on for your physical fitness, also has a really big impact on your mental fitness as well. So it's really hard to let go of those things at a time where you're already stressed. So you're already in this like really difficult situation, whatever the crisis is. And now you have someone like me say to you, you got to cut that $100 a month out of your budget. And what I push back and say is, I hear you. I get it. I know this is hard, but this is temporary. Crisis budgets are not meant to last very long. We're talking, 3 to 12 months is how long a crisis budget should really last. Ideally, 3 to 6. 12 is like in a really extreme situation. So it's going to be tougher right now, but what can we do to balance that? Okay, so we know the gym is really important, but we also know that that $100 is going to go a really long way when you've lost a significant amount of income or when you all of a sudden have very high medical bills. So what can we do instead? And brainstorm, what can we be doing at home? Are there free programs out there? Are there less expensive programs out there? And that's where that perspective of this is painful, this stinks, but it's temporary is really important to maintain in crisis budget mode.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of things that in crisis mode I've had to cut out, and I tell myself they'll come back, they'll come back,
This
and
too shall pass, right?
this, yes.
It seems like in this mode too, creativity, this is a good place for people to create, like where you're mentioning the gym, like brainstorming, like you said, what could I be doing instead? Do I live by a park?
Yeah.
Even lifting certain things at home. I remember seeing things, I don't know if it was during the pandemic or whatever, like lifting older women lifting soup cans or like,
Yep.
because things are, things that you or bottles of water that you can pick up, things that you get creative and it takes more thought and effort. But if you're in that crisis mode and you really need the dollars,
Yeah.
then it's worth taking the time to really get creative and brainstorm.
Yeah, and Janine, you've given your listeners a lot of really good examples, especially over the summer in your episodes, of free activities in Scranton, in northeastern PA. And that's one thing we can't forget is that we do live in a very wonderful area, and I'm sure the listeners in other cities also have access to free days at museums, free concerts in the park, different events. I'm a mom. I've got two little kids who, grew up in a world where they need to be entertained at all times, and we're working on that. But when we went into crisis budgeting mode, we started going to the library a lot more. And now that we're not in crisis budgeting mode, we're still there once a week. We built up this real love for it. My son joined this amazing program over the summer where they battled the books. It was a lot of fun, but it was a free program for these kids. So there's a lot out there, and I really appreciate all the sharing you did of those things, because it's the women and the people I'm helping that I reiterate them to, and I say, no, you don't have to be miserable to save money. Like, you can still have fun, you can still enjoy all the things your hometown has to offer.
Yeah. And I mean, the summer, Luzerne County, for me, it was like, okay, it's a little bit of a drive, but free yoga classes every Saturday they had. So there are those kind of opportunities out there. And there you've got fresh air, you've got the exercise that you want, and you're not even paying for it. So it's really great. I want to mention someone, I'm not going to mention by name because it's not my story and I don't know, but I met with someone recently, a gentleman who shared his story. And it was, I don't know that you'd call it the crisis, but it sounds like he was being extreme, but it was a really interesting story. If you don't mind me sharing briefly,
Yeah.
what he shared with me was that for him, and this is where I know you talk a lot about like the budgeting, our financial health and the mental health is very parallel. It's very, one affects the other like really closely. They're tied together. He was not happy at his job as a computer programmer and he wanted to leave it, and it was like a case of what, how do I need to live so that I don't have to work at a job I don't want. So I mean, again, this is not exactly crisis, but like he really cut a lot and he saved money, and he said, I just want to practice my craft. He was a musician, and he said he got rid of his car. He was involved in things that were in walking distance. He walked to the grocery store. I mean, he chuckled that he might have to make more trips because you can't exactly carry like a giant 24 pack of water easily if you're walking like half a mile. But it was doable, and for him, and I just want to share the lesson that I was like really light bulb above my head, and not just light bulb but like ET with the heart glowing, because I think it's such a beautiful lesson that I think if we had the discipline we all could learn from. What he wanted to do was prove to himself that he didn't have to ever take a job again that he did not want, that made him miserable, because he knew he could live, I guess you could say in a way extreme, because he wasn't allowing himself, he, like the car was gone, all that stuff, but he knew it gave him such a sense of freedom to say, I know I can live like this. So yes, okay, I'll get a job and hopefully I'll get one that I enjoy and I'll get that money back, but I won't ever take a job again that I don't love, because I don't have to. And that was his lesson. And I think that's such an interesting, I had not talked to anyone who shared that with me before. And I loved that lesson. And I think there is discipline involved. There is certainly control and everything, but I think it's just such a valuable, interesting lesson that if people are willing to do that, that they could be happier, because I think that's one of the biggest things you hear people say, how unhappy they are on their job. And what is it usually tied to? Got to have that paycheck.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. His story, it's interesting because on one end it sounds crisis because of how lean he went in his budget and how much he cut out, how much he drastically changed. But it almost sounds to me more of this, like this next phase of budgeting I'd love to talk about, which is goal focused.
Mhm.
And he had this goal, he had this dream, and it sounds glorious. I would last maybe 3 days, but it sounds lovely, to live that way, to have that freedom, but having that goal focused budget. So what's interesting is, kind of along the same lines. One of my first experiences when I was budgeting, when I first started out with this, my husband and I, we decided to go down to one income, and at the same time, I was blessed with a promotion. But we decided that we were going to design our budget so that we were only living on the one income, but at the previous salary. So we were going to pretend I wasn't getting this additional salary. We were going to keep it at this one level. And we said that our goal was to never live above that level, so that we were always living below our means. And we designed our budget to be focused on that. That, we always knew if we bought a new house, it had to be as if we only made that amount of money. And that served us so well, because we've had years where we've had two incomes, we've had years where we've had one income, we've had a half a year with no income and or very little income. And we've always been okay because we've always been living kind of on this pretend budget that, we were not going to let the big things, automobiles, house, some of the larger items that you think of, we weren't going to let them get to a point where we were um, living at our means. We were always below. So he's proven to himself that he can do that. And that feeling, I know what that feels like, to prove to yourself that you can live on much less than you're used to making. It's very liberating.
Hmm.
It brings you so much peace. And it has a huge impact on your mental health because now you can make those choices. You have the freedom. And when I think about goal focused budgets, it's not just the personal achievement goals like him and I are talking about here, but if you're saving for something. So if you got your eyes set that in the next 1 to 5 years you're going to buy a home, or you're going to buy a new car, or two new cars, whatever it might be, that you're designing your budget to make sure that you can afford those things when the time comes, and that you're building that savings line becomes really important. The other big area where I work with people with goal focused budgets is when they're paying off debt. So when you're working to become debt free and then ultimately work on savings, but that debt free part, you want to put as much of your money as you can towards the debt payments, towards getting that debt out of there. The best way to do that is when you sit down and when you're looking at your budget, the biggest thing in your head needs to be, my goal is to become debt free. It's not, my goal is to make sure I'm paying my debt, but also be able to afford to do XYZ. Yeah, you may be able to, and that's okay, but you've got to stay focused on that primary goal. What is it you're really doing this for? And the more you focus on that goal, like, this magic starts to happen, where at first you start and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I can do this. I can put, $300-400 a month towards my debt. And as time goes on, you're like, no, I can put more. I can put more. And it just starts like building. It's amazing how you see the shift when you're really focused on that goal.
That, I mean, I think a lot of people can totally relate to that, but like having those goals too, like it's funny, we talked about before the three different types of things you were going to talk about, scenarios, and I didn't even, it's like, duh, yeah, trying to become debt free basically, because clearly that's the goal. But even I'm sure there are other goals as far as being able, would you say you could apply the same to like being able to afford something, like, if you're working towards something new that you want to have. And I mean, obviously, if it's within your budget, right?
Yeah,
if you're making enough or whatever, but like, okay, what do I need to do to get that boat, or to have that big family vacation, or that trip to Europe that we've talked about for 4 years? I mean, that's a goal. So you can be doing this one year and then maybe you don't do it again for another year, but at different times of your life, you're probably going to have a lot of different goals that you're going to work through, or work toward, I should say.
absolutely. And I'm in that stage. I've kind of shifted my budget now from really that crisis, and not crisis in the sense that, oh, everything's bad and life is over. No, just crisis in the sense of, we've gone through a lot of changes. We need to really watch what we're doing here. And now we've shifted to this, goal focused budget, because we have some really big things coming up that we want to make sure we have the money for. One of them is my fantasy of having a minivan. I'm like embarrassed to even say that out loud.
Oh boy.
Um, I swore I would never be one of those people, but now that I have like two full size children, and they have multiple friends, which is wonderful, but they also want to go places. I do have this minivan fantasy. My whole Facebook marketplace is just minivans. So I have that goal, and then I have a daughter that's a gymnast, and this year is affordable, but I know that future years won't be. So I'm already saving up. I'm already like kind of pretending like that expense is there, so that when it does come, the family can handle it and we're ready for it. And when she
Yeah.
makes it to the Olympics, maybe you can have her.
That's what was in my head. I was going to say, you getting ready for to hire a Ukrainian or Russian coach? I know I could be a coach
That's
from
what
anywhere. I'm
she.
just
Yep.
saying.
Nope. She's. That's what she talks about. So
Yep. Well, then yeah, that'll be a different budget. You'll have to get prepared for. Yeah.
yes.
Um, so we talked about crisis budgets, goal, when you have a goal, what is let's talk about the third type of scenario, budget that I know we all can relate to this one for sure.
Yeah, so the third type is I call steady state. I'm trying to think of a cooler name that I want to call that. But for now, it's steady state. And it really, this is where most people stop budgeting. This is where the budgeting train derails, like for so many people, because they're like, I made it through this crisis. I reached my goals. I'm debt free. I bought that house. I got the car. And now I'm just going to do whatever and see what happens. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble and where the cycle begins all over again. When we lose sight of what we're really spending, and all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe I'll use that credit card I hid in that back desk drawer. Maybe I'll use that for this because maybe I'll get some points. And we start to kind of pick up the bad habits that we all were taught fresh out of high school. um, but that's where it's actually the most important. Steady state budgeting is how you maintain your financial health for as long as you possibly can. And having that steady state, meaning I'm just budgeting all the year through. I'm just, I'm once a week, I'm going into my spreadsheet or I'm in my app and I'm catching up on the purchases I made and I'm saying, well, does this still align with my values? Are things in this category getting a little out of hand? And it's amazing what you'll find when you do that. One conversation I had recently, somebody that I was working with, she found that her grocery expenses were all of a sudden like really out of line, and she's in steady state. But when we did a little digging, we realized that she was starting to buy like way too much processed food, like a significant amount of more processed food than she was buying before. And it was easy. And it was food that, just kind of made her life a little bit simpler. But it was not just hurting her budget. Like in the long run, these bad habits were building up. And then she was, the family was going to get addicted to these processed foods. And it's like starts this negative cycle of not just your finances, but your physical health. So interesting things come out of keeping an eye on where you are in steady state.
That's so interesting. And again, I think it's just one more relatable and important reminder of how finances aren't just like that boring, like what I used to think years ago. It's just like, oh, checkbooks and CDs and interest rates. Ew. But like this is life, literally life. Because as you're saying, they're looking at it going, ooh, I'm buying these processed foods. So what's that going to do to our waistline? What is that going to do for our blood sugar maybe? Or what's that going to do to our energy? Are we crashing? Like what is that food doing to us overall and our pocketbook? So it's like it's so interesting how all of this stuff ties together or aligns, I mean, and that mental health piece I think is so important because we've talked about this. At the end of the day, you do need to do all the stuff that you need to do. But at the same time, sometimes you have to give yourself a break too, because if you make bad choices, like I make bad choices all the time, it's not going to help to beat yourself up, or it's not going to like help to be like laying up at night awake in bed staring at, what I mean? Like make the best choices you can. And if you need to start over the next morning, start over and start fresh and say, okay, I perhaps should not have made that purchase, but let's recalibrate. Let's start over.
Yeah. And you certainly can't beat yourself up. Now we are women, we're going to do it no matter
Of
what,
course.
all the time. But we also have to remind ourselves that, you know, we were raised to make these bad decisions, and not to blame our parents, but in school, like I always tell the story of how my first day on a college campus, I was given a credit card with like a $5,000 limit. I was 18. I had been 18 for like 5 seconds, and they gave me a credit card, and everything spiraled from there, like terribly spiraled from there. And I was normal. I wasn't weird, I wasn't dumb. I was doing exactly what every other kid on campus was doing, because we weren't taught this in school. And my rant about that. And my parents, they always listen when I'm on your podcast, and they know that it's not their fault, but they didn't teach us. for a lot of reasons, but it just wasn't talked about. Finances weren't a thing we sat around the dinner table and talked about. And before we started our conversation, Janine, I was sharing with you that I do talk about, I talk about these things with my kids. They probably hear way too much about budgeting, but I asked them, what do you think a crisis budget would be used for? And my son said, "Oh, well, when you want another cat, but mom says you can't afford it." You're not getting another cat. That's number one. Then I saw a kitten in Dixon City on the side of the highway, and I was like,
Oh no.
maybe we should have another cat. But
It's a
um,
different kind of crisis.
yeah, but then I was able to continue the conversation with them and give them actual examples of what a crisis budget would be used for. But how many people are having those conversations in the car after school? That's it's not common. So one of my goals, especially like, working with women, is to teach them that like we've got to normalize this conversation and embracing a steady state budget. Budgeting when you don't think you have to budget is the best way to normalize it, because it just becomes part of your household. And if you have children in the home or grandchildren around, they see you do it and it's just normal. This is what people do.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point too about it's not what was talked about. Like I never learned it in school. My gosh, nothing. Would have been so useful. And thankfully that is changing. But it was almost like taboo to talk about like back, over the years past. It's like, oh, you don't bring up money. And you certainly, never talking about how much people make, or like it was like taboo. You just don't talk about how much things cost. And I think in our household, I might have overheard some conversations, but it wasn't ever really discussed with us. We did, my brother and I had some chores, feeding the dog or whatever that maybe we'd get an allowance for. And, I got my first, job, my paper route at 14. So I understood the value of money then, although of course I'm not exactly a good model of making good choices with money as someone who has high debt. But I mean, I wish we had those conversations and training. So I'm so glad to hear that you are doing that and you are talking about it. And it seems like, we would have never thought of this, but it's so easy to incorporate in conversations. Like you said,
Yeah.
you're having these conversations with your kids and they're normal and they're natural. I mean, hell, kids having lemonade stands. Hello. I mean, that's how there's so many easy, and it doesn't have to be forced. It doesn't even have to be super complicated. And I think
Yeah.
it's great that you're doing that and teaching and reminding women to do that with their kids.
Yeah. And it's not hard to find out ways to make it age appropriate. I know that's always a concern. I have a lot of people say to me, "Oh, you're stressing your kids out," and I think I've talked about that on your show before. But I'm not. You can go ahead and ask them. They love being on podcasts and YouTube. But when they're young, like it doesn't have to be so complicated. So my kids are still fairly young. They're under 10. One thing that we decided we're going to start this year, and we'd read about this and we've been thinking about this for a while, but for their birthdays, we tend to spend an outrageous amount of money on birthdays. By the time we buy them a gift, make them a party, maybe also make a family party in addition to a kid party, and then take them somewhere special. Like it gets crazy. And then, buy snacks for the school or whatever we might do. So this year we're going to try something. We're going to give them a pie chart, and we're not going to worry about the actual dollar amount, because I don't really want them to know how much we're spending on birthdays right now, because they are still so young. But we're going to give them a pie chart, and we're going to say, okay, you can divide this pie chart into how much you want us to spend on gift, party, or experience. We're going to have a couple of different categories, and we'll let them choose how things get split up. And we're going to try to teach them that, okay, if you want the bulk of the money spent on a party, it means you're going to get a smaller or no gift, and that's okay. Like we want to start teaching them that there's choices to be made with your money, and that those are fun choices. Like we want to make it exciting and fun. I am a little afraid my son's going to put like the whole pie into experience, because he wants to go to DreamWorks something or another in Jersey, and I feel like that's going to be a lot. So I just hope he makes it the whole pie, so that I don't have to do anything else besides this DreamWorks thing.
Keep it simple for mom too, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If you don't mind.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, this is all valuable. And I have to apologize. And I'll say maybe this will lead to a conversation about my budget. As you're talking, I apologize. A couple times I'm distracted because my neighbor's dog is barking off the wall. So I'm wondering, I have to look at my budget. Is it in my budget to get the one of those sonar things that supposedly helps us to minimize the barking? I'll be working on that on Amazon later. But anyway, yeah. So my apologies. I'm like hearing it in the background. I don't know. Is an hour too long for a dog to be barking? Anyway, how can we
Yeah.
tie that to finances? Anyway, but thank you so much. This has been so valuable. And again, let's give people a reminder that, of course, no matter what you celebrate or what, religions or customs or whatever, I know most of us at this time of year are going to be treating friends, family to different types of gifts or kind of celebrations. And we won't go down that path because we did talk about it before. So maybe you can check out the episode we had last year around this time. But it is good just as a reminder, as I'm sure Emily will tell us. Remember, you should be working within a budget, right? When you're,
Right.
it's not like the sky's the limit. I love my family and friends, so anything goes. No, that's not true. You don't have to show them you love them with dollar signs.
You don't. There's so many other and better ways to honor the holidays, to honor your friends and make your friends feel good. I have so many tips and tricks for budgeting through the holidays, but at the root of all of them is honesty. That's the most important thing, is that you're honest with your partner, you're honest with your children to some extent, you're honest with your friends and family, and you're firm in your values and your priorities. And when you do those things, it's easier to make the choices. It's easier to say no to certain activities. We throw a pretty mean holiday party at our house, but we don't do it every year because it is an outrageous amount of money, and we do it every other year, maybe every third year, depending on pandemics and such. But our friends know, like, we'd love to have you all every year, and we'd love to party like that and ring in the holidays, but it's not realistic for us because we have other things that come first. Um, so finding ways to just be honest, to prioritize, and procrastination does get in the way for holidays, because if you do procrastinate, unfortunately, you can't take advantage of a lot of deals, and you end up spending a little bit more in the long run. So we all know Black Friday comes up in November. We do a ton of shopping. We do not physically go to stores because my anxiety would like cripple me for the day, but we do a lot of online shopping. We shop really local too. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about Lakeland Orchard and Rova's Family Farm. We always buy our kids season passes on Black Friday. It's the best day of the year to buy season passes. So that's like one of their really big gifts for the holidays. And we have a few things like that where that we always try to buy on that day, and just do some digging, see what's out there. And I have a spreadsheet because obviously
Of
I have a
course you do,
spreadsheet.
Emily.
Of course I do. I find
Of course
my
you do.
holiday gifts, but here's
I
what's
have a
great.
desk full of crappy notes all over.
But you know what the best part of my holiday gift spreadsheet is? I know what I got everybody for the last 3 years.
I remember you saying that last year, and I'll tell you what, that is super helpful because let's face it, the mind, you're like, I can't remember.
Nope.
Yep.
Nope. I have no idea. Right this minute, I could not tell you what I got my mom last year, but my spreadsheet knows, and I won't buy it again this year. Or if I do, it'll be another color.
And that is smart. So not only are you paying attention to the money you have and what to spend, but you're like, oh, okay, that's what I bought last year. So it's actually very helpful. But yeah, to your point too about procrastination, because I'm that person often. You, like you said, you miss out on the deals, but then you also probably feel a little more pressure because it is a later date and you're like, oh shoot, I need to get something. And then you might even not only not be saving money, but you might not even be getting the best, most thoughtful or appropriate gift for the person because you're like, oh shoot, I'm running out of time, I'm running out
Mhm.
of options. So it really does pay to sit down and think about these things sooner rather than later, I would say, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things I noticed over the last year is, unfortunately, the mail system hasn't been as high quality as it was before. So even if you have Prime, your Amazon packages aren't always coming as fast as you would like them to. So one of the challenges I saw people run into last year was they ordered gifts pretty last minute and they didn't arrive in time. So then they ended up going out to a store, buying something to replace it so that they didn't go to a party empty handed, or like, didn't go to wake up Christmas morning empty handed, and you end up paying double. Now, ideally, you return the item that you don't need, but that falls through the cracks too sometimes, or you somehow justify keeping both. So it has a lot of added costs by waiting till the last minute.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, you procrastinators like me, don't wait on it. Do
Don't
it.
wait.
I will say I'm proud of myself. I can say this, but well, mom doesn't always listen, so but maybe she'll listen. Who knows? So I won't reveal. But I've already gotten her something. That's something that I bought online that I knew she would like, and it's way in advance. I'm so proud of myself. That's one person. That's one gift, but
That's
that's it.
good.
But it's something to put in the plus column. You got to give me a win here for something.
I will 100% give you that win. It's fantastic. Keep it up. Do like
Yeah.
5 more people.
Yeah, yay. Well, as always, Emily, I want to thank you so much because, again, I've learned a lot and I know my listeners have. And I'll shout out my number one fan, Oliver. It's funny because he always learns, but like he'll say, you know what? He is very good with budgeting because his mom was a banker.
Mhm.
Chrissy, God rest her soul, she was an absolute sweetheart. But like he's like, he'll like basically amplify what you say. He's like, I already kind of know a lot of this stuff, but she's so right because these are the lessons my mom taught me. So, for folks like me who need more of this information and we just didn't get it, this is always so helpful, and it is just so important that we try to find that balance too. I mean, we need to do the budgeting, but it's also important to consider our mental and overall well-being as well. So, thank you so much for giving us all of those valuable tips that can help us with everything.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me on, and I hope I can come back soon.
Absolutely. And I'm gonna give one last thank you to you too. I want to thank you again for being a podcast sponsor. It means the world to me. And for folks listening, if you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, I assure you it's cheaper than you might think. It's cheaper
Mhm.
than if you're a coffee person and you're buying Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks every day. This is cheaper to sponsor my podcast. And you'll be helping amplify and promote the voices of women every week, helping the audience out there to learn something, to connect with people. And you're going to help this gal right here, me, an individual solopreneur. I love having these women on every week. And if you are interested, please reach out to me. Again, my audience is primarily female, 35 to like 69. And I'd love to talk to you. But as I always say, you don't have to have make a financial investment. You can also support this podcast by doing something really easy, sharing it with a friend, foe, or anyone you know, writing a review, a test or a testimonial. And here's another thought. If you listen, please feel free to reach out to me anytime to say, "Hey, I enjoyed this episode or that episode," because it's also helpful to know how this podcast is making a difference. Because occasionally I'll run into women who will be like, "Yeah, that was a great episode. Please let us know." And I always say us, but it's really just me. But let me know because, again, it means a lot. And it actually, that's another form of currency. A little bit of kindness and a little bit of encouragement also helps to fuel me to keep going. So, thank you so much to Emily. Thank you to my listeners. Keep on listening. I appreciate you, as I always say, from the bottom of my heart and the bottom of my wine glass.